seems a bit odd for me to be sitting when all of you are standing. So I think I'll also stand.
No, it's okay. Sir, please.
When I feel tired, I'll sit down. Well, the argument for having welfare expenditures of some kind or the other has always been there. Typically, the argument in the days of pre-Keynesian economics, which informed classical liberalism. In other words, there was a liberal political thought underlying which was pre-Keynesian economics. But with Keynes and the Keynesian revolution, there is also a change in the political philosophy to what Keynes himself called new liberalism. Keynes, if you look at his book, Essays in Persuasion, he keeps talking about his position as one of new liberalism. So whether you look at classical liberalism, the argument for welfare expenditures being undertaken was essentially a normative one. That, as you know, in the market system functions well, but of course it functions well on the basis of a given distribution of endowments among economic agents. Therefore, if the endowments among economic agents are to be changed, and of course, on normative grounds you can argue that these endowments should be changed, then of course the state can intervene in order to bring about such a change. That was the basic argument that existed earlier. You work with a Walrasian equilibrium, and in the Walrasian equilibrium, economic agents come with different endowments, and of course then they interact on the market. The market produces an efficient outcome, efficiency defined in terms of a Pareto optimality. So the point is that if you change the endowments, and the state can play the role in changing endowments, that's fine. With Keynesian revolution, however, the argument for welfare expenditures became much stronger, because now it was not just a normative argument. There's a good thing if endowments are more equally distributed, but that if there is a state of involuntary unemployment, lots of people are unemployed, lots of unutilized capacity exists. In that case, welfare expenditures undertaken by the state is a means of enlarging the level of output and employment. In other words, Keynes actually argued that even if the state simply got people to dig holes in the ground and fill them up, even then it would have a beneficial effect through the multiplier on employment and output, and more of useful goods would be produced because of the demand generated on the part of those who are engaged in digging holes in the ground and filling them up. So one was the argument that because of the existence of the multiplier, welfare expenditures would actually improve employment and output in a situation where there is involuntary unemployment in society. But there was a second thing also, second implication also, that if you have a situation of involuntary unemployment and the state undertakes welfare expenditures, in that case, the state does not have to take resources away from anybody. In other words, suppose it is the case, just imagine a picture. The state spends 100 rupees in the form of welfare expenditure. Let's say 100 rupees are simply handed over to the poor. They go and spend these 100 rupees. That generates income, that generates employment, that generates output in a situation of involuntary unemployment. And assuming that we don't bother about trade issues, a closed economy, suppose the government had spent these 100 rupees by borrowing from, let us say, the bank of the Reserve Bank of India. In that case, ultimately, these rounds of multiplier would stop only when enough savings had been generated in private hands in excess of private investment, which are exactly equal to the amount of fiscal deficit that the government had undertaken to start with. And the government simply taxes away these savings, in which case the budget is balanced, but on the other hand, nobody has been pinched by the fact of government expenditure because money came to them, additional income came to them, which otherwise would not have come. And it has come to them in order to generate the extra savings that the government is taxing away. Therefore, relative to the initial position, nobody's wealth, nobody's income is being affected. Therefore, even the rich are not being affected, even when the tax falls on the rich. You see, even though the tax falls on the rich are not being affected because what they are handing over to the government in the form of taxes is something that was not in their hands in the beginning, but it accrues to them because of government expenditure. Therefore, the argument was that welfare expenditures are in fact a very good way of generating employment in a situation of involuntary unemployment, generating larger employment and output in a situation of involuntary unemployment, and it is a non-zero sum game. That it's not as if the government taxing away implies somebody has less, but I mean it's a non-zero sum game because of the fact that it's not as if the government taxing implies somebody has less. That would be the case if it was a zero sum game. But it's a non-zero sum game. Therefore, welfare expenditures are a very useful way of government intervention in the economy to generate employment and output. Now, at the moment, however, there can be an additional argument which is even more powerful, and that argument is that because of the existence of neoliberalism, because of the existence of a neoliberal economic regime, there is now everywhere in the world, because of the extreme income inequalities that the neoliberal regime has generated, there is a kind of greater unemployment, reduction in the degree of effective demand, the magnitude of effective demand, and therefore there is tendency towards stagnation. I mean, even this is not something which is said only by critics of the system, but even right-wing economists are talking about secular stagnation. So there is a tendency towards a secular stagnation in the world economy. It's visible particularly in Europe when you look at the GDP growth itself in real terms. The GDP in Europe in 2022 is marginally lower than in 2008. And of course, in the United States, well, that is not the case. Unemployment rate appears very low, but that's because of the fact that labor force participation rate has gone down. If you calculate on the basis of the participation rate that existed earlier in 2008, you have substantial unemployment in the United States now, about 8%. So all over the world, there is a slowing down of the growth rate. There's a tendency towards stagnation. There's a tendency towards unemployment. And because of this, one can say that neoliberal capitalism has run into a kind of crisis. Now, in this crisis, governments are typically quite incapable of intervening in the way that Keynes had suggested they should intervene. Why not? Suppose the government actually spends 100 rupees by taxing, let us say, the workers, or the workers and peasants and so on, an equal amount, 100 rupees. Then the government's expenditure generates 100 rupees of additional demand, but the tax on the workers and so on, who virtually spend their entire income, reduces their consumption demand by an equivalent amount, and therefore there is no net increase in demand. There will be a net increase in demand only if either government expenditure is financed through a fiscal deficit, in which case you are not taxing anybody. You spend 100 rupees, don't tax anybody. Or if government expenditure is financed by taxing the rich, it's because part of the tax they pay would come out of their savings, in which case you find there will be a net increase in aggregate demand. But both these avenues of enlarging government expenditure, either by financing it through a fiscal deficit or by financing it through taxes on the rich, the capitalists, the better off section of the population. Both these are really disliked by globalized finance. Now the point is that neoliberalism implies that we have nation states, we have governments, we have Indian government, Pakistani government, Polish government, Hungarian government and so on. We have nation states but nation states confronting international capital, confronting finance that is globally mobile. If a nation state confronts finance that is globally mobile, then the nation state has really got to do what finance wants it to do. Otherwise, there will be a huge outflow of finance and there will be a crisis in the nation state. Therefore, the executive authority and, of course, the domain over which this authority operates are not now identical. Executive authority is over the nation, but on the other hand, the domain over which finance operates is the world. As a result, the capacity of the nation states to intervene in the Keynesian fashion is something which has really gone down, because of which the crisis that I was talking about continues. The government cannot really do anything about it because of the fact that it is confronted with finance that is not confined to the nation, but finance that is globalized. Now, in this kind of situation, you actually find that since the crisis persists, since the government cannot do anything about it, there is a tendency all over the world for the crisis of neoliberalism to produce a tendency towards neo-fascism. You may have seen in Argentina the other day, Milei got elected, who is a virtual fascist. In Italy, Meloni is now the ruler who belongs to a fascist party. In Germany, AfD, which is really a kind of neo-fascist group, is now getting is second in terms of popularity. In France, similarly, a neo-fascist group of Marine Le Pen is second in terms of popularity. In Turkey, in Hungary, lots of countries you actually find that there is a tendency towards neo-fascism. Neo-fascism arises in a period of crisis of neoliberalism, when neoliberalism cannot really do anything to overcome this crisis. Even in the 1930s, if you remember, during the Great Depression, many countries had actually turned towards fascism as a way of overcoming the crisis, and that was the reason for the emergence of fascism. That reason exists today, though of course the neo-fascist governments cannot also overcome the crisis exactly for the reasons that I was talking about earlier. Namely, they are subject to the same constraints because of the existence of globalized finance, which, let us say, liberal democratic governments have been subjected to. So that, whether you have a neo-fascist government or whether you have a liberal government, they can do very little about the crisis as long as they remain within this web of globalized finance, unless you actually can overcome the country's adherence to financial globalization. Really, there is very little you can do to overcome the crisis. In this, therefore, the tendency towards neo-fascism arises because of the fact that this is a way of shifting the discourse. Because the discourse then becomes not about improving people's living standards, but the discourse then shifts towards othering some minority group. It can be the immigrants, it can be some ethnic minority, it can be the Muslims, it can be... So othering a minority group, creating hatred against that minority group, is something which then takes the form of any talk about the economy, about employment and so on. And this is the way that you find that in these times of time, in the kind of neoliberal regimes, you have a way of coping with the crisis in terms of coping with people's resistance against the crisis, people's anger against the crisis. So you have a kind of neoliberal, neo-fascist alliance which tends to get built up. And if you have to overcome that neoliberal, neo-fascist alliance, you can do so only by mobilizing the people, the workers, the peasants, the petty producers, and so on, against such an alliance. And you can do that only on the basis of some kind of an agenda that actually shifts the discourse back to issues of material life. And that agenda can only be the willing of the Western state. So the argument for a welfare state now is not just a Keynesian argument, but above all, it's also a political argument for overcoming the offense. So for a variety of these reasons now, the idea of building a welfare state has really come onto the agenda in every democratic society or in every society that wishes to remain democratic. Now, the typical form that people have been talking about welfare expenditures, the typical form that this has taken is to talk of a basic income being handed over to everybody. You must have come across the basic minimum income. That is something which was mooted some time ago in the economic survey of the government of India when Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister. But that idea has continued to remain. That many economists are talking in terms of providing a basic minimum level of income to everybody. Now this basic minimum income, of course, has got some problem with it. I believe there are at least three problems with the basic minimum income idea. The first problem is that this is something which actually makes the basic minimum income a favor on the part of the government to the people. In other words, it becomes an act of charity that the government is actually engaging in for the sake of the people. That such a good government that is actually giving everybody a basic minimum income. In other words, the people are treated here not as dignified citizens of a democratic society. They are treated here as persons to whom favors have to be given. I believe that's a very basic ethical objection which I have to this idea of a basic minimum income. The second, of course, is that if your fiscal situation is good, you give basic minimum income. If your fiscal situation tightens, in that case, you reduce the basic minimum income that you give to everyone. So it is something which then becomes subject to the government's whims and caprices. And this is something which therefore makes it not a matter of, certainty, but a matter which can be, depends on how good the world is, how good the fiscal situation of the government is. The most important objection I have is that, suppose you want all children to be educated. One way of doing it would be to make sure that there are schools in the neighborhood. The other way of doing it would be simply to hand over money to people. If you hand over money to people, saying that, okay, you have the money, now you educate your children. In that case, if there are no schools in the neighborhood, then where do they send their children? So it is not enough to provide cash, but what you have to do is actually provide all types of actual facilities, healthcare facilities, school facilities, and so on. In the absence of that, simply handing over cash in the name of a minimum basic income is something which is not really a very appealing idea. Now, therefore, in view of all this, what I would like to suggest here, this is what I want to speak this evening really, is that a certain basic right should be the right of every citizen. That just as people have fundamental political rights, there should be a set of fundamental economic rights. Now, these fundamental economic rights, therefore, would give every person, not just some target group, not just some specially deprived person, but every person, certain kinds of access to some minimum conditions of life to which they are entitled as citizens. It's not a question of the government having money and therefore having a kind of transfer to the people, which next year the government has no money, it reduces. But this must be a right that everybody has. So I would really recommend a set of fundamental economic rights Now, whenever the Indian Constitution, whenever we talked of constitutional issues, everybody was talking about the improvement in people's lives. The basic idea, the basic outline of the Indian Constitution was drawn up in 1931 at the Karachi Congress, where a resolution was passed shortly after Bhagat Singh's martyrdom, in which they not only stated all these things, namely that universal adult franchise, equality before law, and things of freedom of expression and so on, but they also talked about everybody having a certain minimum level of living. When the Constituent Assembly was drafting the Constitution, likewise, there was talk of everybody having, as a citizen, a certain minimum level of living. But when the Constitution actually came out, then you found that all the economic provisions of the Constitution were put into the directive principles of state policy. And the directive principles are not enforced. Nobody can take the government to the court if the directive principles of state policy are being violated. Therefore, in some sense, there was a limitation of, I think the Indian Constitution is an excellent document, but there are some limitations of it. And one of those limitations consists in the fact that a minimum standard of life is not a right of the citizens, but it is something which is supposed to be the government's job to provide it. That's what the directive principles say. But if the government does not provide it, then there's nothing you can do about it. It's not surprisingly, 75 years after independence, we still have amazing poverty in the country. All these governments talk about poverty disappearing, 5% poor and so on. It's just complete nonsense. So, you have, therefore, I would suggest that there should be a set of fundamental economic rights, just as we have fundamental political rights. Now, the immediate question that arises, how do we finance this? After all, can we afford to have fundamental economic rights? So we made some calculations. And according to those calculations, if you have 5 fundamental economic rights, which are the following: a right to food, which basically implies that every person is entitled to food, to obtaining food from the public distribution system, exactly on the same terms as the BPL population was entitled to prior to the pandemic. In other words, before the pandemic, the BPL population was really entitled to food, 2 rupees a kilo, a certain amount per month per head, and that was from the public distribution system. Everybody should have exactly that kind of an entitlement. So the right to food is this. Secondly, a right to employment, by which, what I mean is, if a person does not have a job, if the state cannot provide the person with a job, then the person should be paid a full wage, exactly as if he is employed. Not an unemployment amount, but a full wage, exactly as he's employed. You can have 2 categories of wages for unskilled and skilled, but the wages can in fact be statutorily determined, fixed by law, so that if a person does not have employment by any chance, full wage, but of course the idea therefore is to provide the person with employment, obviously. It makes more sense for the state to have an employed person than simply give a wage to somebody who's unemployed. The third would be a right to free, quality, universal education, at least up to the higher secondary level for every child. Okay? This basically means that every child would have an access to public schooling. Mind you, this is something which you find even in many advanced capitalist countries, where the moment you go to a particular area to settle down, you are supposed to send your child to the neighborhood school. If you don't send your child to the neighborhood school, then you are considered to be parents who don't deserve to have that child. You are considered irresponsible parents, and the government in an extreme case, they take child away from you because you are responsible parent. So the idea of free quality education, at least up to the higher secondary level, and of course beyond that through scholarships and so on. But the universal is something which should be the third fundamental economic right. The fourth fundamental economic right should be the right to free, quality, universal health care through a national health service. In other words, not this insurance thing, but through a national health service. Like you have in Britain, like you used to have in the Soviet Union, like you have in Scandinavian countries. The fifth right would be a right to a living old age pension, a living old age non-contributory pension, and of course disability benefits. Now you'll be surprised to know that at the present moment, the pension per month which the central government gives to old people is 200 rupees, which is just that fundamentally it has to be a living, non-contributory old age pension for everyone. Of course, if I'm teaching in JNU and I get a pension from JNU, in that case I will opt out of that particular scheme. But on the other hand, for everybody who does not belong to any such institutional scheme, a non-contributory old age pension, which is a living amount, an amount that can sustain a person's living, becomes essential, and that it would be the fifth fundamental economic right, along with, of course, disability benefits. That if somebody is disabled, somebody is handicapped, then they should also be looked after by the state. If you take all these five fundamental economic rights, then our calculations say that in addition to what is being spent currently under these various heads, you would require about 10% of the GDP. You would require about 10% of GDP to finance all these fundamental economic rights. Now, if you have to spend 10% of GDP, then you require to raise as additional taxes about 7% of GDP. Because after all, as you spend, now it would come back to you as taxes, because of which then you don't really need to raise the entire 10% as additional taxes. You require about 7% as additional taxes. That's assuming a tax GDP ratio of 0.15. That is 50%. So, you have therefore to raise about 7% extra taxes of GDP in order to be able to finance these five fundamental economic rights. And let me repeat, these economic rights are not for this or that targeted group. These rights are universal. Everybody is entitled to these rights, and people can take the government to court if the government does not provide these rights, because they are constitutionally guaranteed. Now 7% of GDP can be raised as the additional taxes through only two taxes which are levied on the top 1% of the population. One is a 2% wealth tax. That if you have a 2% wealth tax levied on the top 1% of the population, in that case, you would raise a certain amount. And the second is an inheritance tax of roughly 1/3. And suppose, again levied on the top 1%. In other words, somebody belonging to the top 1% of the population wants to hand over a part of the wealth to their children, then this wealth that is handed over, 1/3 of it should be taken away by the state. Now these taxes are by no means so particularly high or strenuous. You see, there is a philosophy of capitalism. The defenders of capitalism, not me, I'm not a defender of capitalism. The defenders of capitalism say that, look, the capitalists earn an income because they have some special point. They have some special ability. So the capitalist income is really a reward for some special ability that they have. But if they have this special ability, let us agree on, let's assume that they're right. in that case, their children have to show this special ability before they get entitled to a similar income. If you so to say that the capitalists get an income because they have a special ability does not justify inheritance. In other words, you have to have everybody starting from the same, from a common point. Some with special ability would become capitalists and earn an income, but on the other hand, if you earn an income because your father was a capitalist, in that case, no special ability is required for that. Therefore, even those who are defenders of capitalism have typically agreed to the idea of having substantial inheritance taxes. In a country like Japan, for instance, inheritance tax is about 40%. Now, similarly, in the US and so on, fairly high inheritance taxes. Now, in India, there is none. In India, there is absolutely no inheritance tax, which is scandalous. So, the inheritance tax, as just 1/3 of the wealth that's handed down, is something which is really extremely modest and mild. Similarly, when you look at the wealth tax, in India again there is hardly any wealth tax at all. Now, everybody knows, you look at newspapers, that wealth inequalities are going up dramatically. Now, if wealth inequalities are going up and you have no wealth taxation whatsoever, in that case, nothing is being done to check this. And of course, this is something which therefore needs to be addressed. And again, compared to the proposals which are made in the US, for instance, one of the presidential candidates in the last election was Elizabeth Warren, who had suggested a wealth tax in 2 slabs, 1%, 2%. Another candidate, Bernie Sanders, had suggested a wealth tax in several slabs, the maximum being 7% of the wealth at the highest level. All that I'm suggesting is just 2% wealth tax levied on the top 1% of the population, 0 on all the others, just the top 1% of the population, a 2% wealth tax. So you find that actually these two taxes would be quite enough to raise 7% of GDP, which would be quite enough to raise additional 10% of GDP of government expenditures, which would be quite enough to finance these 5 fundamental economic rights. Now, the point is that, I just like to end with 3 caveats. The first caveat is, of course, a standard economic caveat. You see, if you have 100 rupees of expenditure and you raise 100 rupees of taxes, 100 rupees of government expenditure, that does not guarantee that there will be no inflation. In other words, the problem of resource mobilization does not end with you simply raising enough of financial resources. Imagine an economy which is supply constrained. If you have 100 rupees of government expenditure, then you would have a profit inflation, profit prices would rise, profit margins would rise, and of course, these 100 rupees would accrue as profit to the capitalists. You take it away, and if you take it away, then the government budget is balanced, but nonetheless, inflation has occurred. And if inflation has occurred, then people's living standards have gone down. So the fact that you are simply balancing expenditure with revenue does not mean that you are not going to have inflation. So the first caveat I'd like to enter is that you have to have appropriate supply management. To have financial resource mobilization matching government expenditures is only to make sure that nobody becomes enriched by government expenditures giving rise to profit inflation. But it does not prevent inflation at all, and for that, therefore, you have to have supply management. For instance, if you have to have a right to food, in that case, you would need to ensure that agricultural output rises, food grain output rises, enough is procured through the government procurement agencies, enough is distributed through the public distribution system and so on. If you're going to have rights to employment, to some extent rights to employment would be automatically fulfilled if you have schooling and so on, because building school buildings, in recruiting teachers and so on itself to provide employment to quite a few. But the point is that you have to have appropriate supply management. You have to have appropriate programs, schemes, and so on in order to make sure that actually supplies of goods are available plentifully. There are enough school buildings, there are enough kind of hospitals, and so on. The care economy expands sufficiently, which again would be a source of employment generation. The second caveat I would like to mention is that I have been talking in entirely macro terms. Of course, in India, as I mentioned, I assume a 15% tax GDP ratio, but the point is that includes the taxes by the state government and the taxes by the central government. So you'd have to have an appropriate mechanism of the distribution of the tax revenue between the centre and the states, both of which can then become jointly responsible for ensuring that these rights are fulfilled. So that would require some kind of an administrative acumen, some kind of an allocation of responsibilities in the centre and the state. The third thing I'd like to mention is that whenever I talk about these fundamental economic rights, everybody tells me, look, I mean, you can't really have a constitutional amendment because in India having a constitutional amendment is an extremely difficult proposition. You'd have to have substantial majority in the parliament, you have to have substantial number of states endorsing this and so on. To that my answer is very simple, that even if you do not have a constitutional amendment, but you have a unanimous resolution in both houses of parliament, as you had for MD and RDGS. When MD and RDGS was introduced, it actually gave, in some sense, a right, through a very limited right, because one member of the household only a maximum of 100 days of work and so on. So it's a very limited right, but nonetheless, it did give a right, in some sense, to the rural household, and only rural areas. But that right was given in the form not of a constitutional amendment, but in the form of a certain amount of, a unanimous resolution passed in both houses of parliament. Now that is an avenue that we could explore, and I think that would be an easier way of introducing this than actually going for the entire constitutional amendment. Of course, if you can have a constitutional amendment, nothing like it, but on the other hand, it's something which can be done in its absence. So the situation is that you can have a welfare state in India which is perfectly feasible, but of course this would require a kind of political will. What is more, it would require something more, because as I mentioned, if you have an enlargement of government spending, suppose you actually introduce the two taxes I'm talking about, globalized finance would get scared. It will start moving out of the country, because they will think, okay, all kinds of crazy leftists have taken over. And if that is the case, then you'd have to have capital controls. You'd have to have controls on the outflow of finance. If you have controls on the outflow of finance, then finance would not come in. If it does not come in, then you would not be able to pay for your trade deficit. If you are not able to pay for your trade deficit, then how do you manage your balance of payments? You'll have to have import control. You'd have to have control over the imports that you can have. And that is something which basically means that both on capital account as well as on trade account, you'll have to break with the neoliberal order that we have. Neoliberalism implies relatively free flow of finance and capital, and relatively free flow of goods and services across country borders. Both these would have to be abandoned. Now, of course, when you abandon this, there would be all kinds of opposition from the advanced countries. They may put sanctions against you, they may call you a rogue state and so on. But the point is that in order to fulfill your constitutional obligations, in order to fulfill the obligations to the people, I believe it is important for the governments to do what is essential, irrespective of who calls you what. And of course, if you have such a welfare state, and the kind of enthusiasm it would generate among the people, would actually be able to make you withstand all these kinds of opposition and resistance on that the advanced countries can actually raise against you. Besides, even when it comes to the advanced countries, they themselves are now violating the rules of neoliberalism. The United States, for instance, now has got trade restrictions against China. Now the point is that is really not part of the neoliberal order. I mean, the neoliberal order says that you can't put tariffs, you cannot put trade restrictions, but the US has against China. Similarly, the US now and the advanced countries as a whole now have got all kinds of sanctions against Russia. They have got sanctions against at least 30 countries all over the world, all of which is a violation of neoliberalism. Now, if that is the case, then I don't see why we should necessarily remain loyal to the letter of neoliberalism if it means that people continue to have another 75 years of degradation. I think I'll stop there.